Hello, and welcome to the Storytellers Club podcast. I'm your host, as always, Chris Hicks. Always your host, and that's always my name. Kind of convenient it works that way. Today, we will be speaking with Gemma Amor. Gemma is a Bram Stoker and British Fantasy Award nominated author, and that's not all. She's also a voice actor, a podcaster, an illustrator, and, as we will find out, a prolific contributor to the No Sleep podcast. We will be discussing two of her stories today. The first is called Zoo, and it can be found in volume 15 of the Best Horror of the Year. The second story, Eggshell, appears in the Human Monsters anthology. This is a truly beautiful story, one of my all-time favorites. So if you want to read these stories before we begin, hit pause now. Welcome back. All right, sit tight, have a listen. Welcome again. Thank you for coming on to talk with me today, because like I was saying before I started recording, I've been a fan of your work for some time. Originally came across your writing when you submitted some things for the No Sleep podcast. You had a series of like 3 or 4 stories on there, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe more.
Oh, I think it's about 30 now.
Wow.
I'm an old hat for No Sleep.
You've been there a while. Wow, that's amazing.
I have since halfway through season 10, which now we're on season 21. So I like to think of myself as a little bit of a stalwart, although I'm not as much as fan favorites like Marcus Demander and C.K. Walker. They've been there much, much longer than me.
Yes, C.K. Walker, big fan of her work as well.
Sure.
Baraska.
It's a great story.
Yeah, and again, she also, like myself, I started off on the Reddit No Sleep site. So yeah, and she transitioned to that. But so yeah, how did you find writing, or how did it find you?
I think I'm going to be very boring and very cliche, and the answer that I always give to this question is because it's the true answer, is that I've always written for as long as I can remember, since I was a kid. I think my first example of regularly writing was just keeping a diary. I kept a personal diary every day of my life from the age of about 10 or 11. And it didn't take long after I started keeping a diary to start writing stories. And my favorite anecdote is that when I was about 12, I was a big reader. I was brought up as an only child, and I spent every day in the library checking out new books and putting books back that I'd read the day before. And I lived kind of alone with my mum in a house in the countryside in the middle of nowhere. So I didn't have the best social life, but I had the library and I had a lot of books. And I used to like putting a tent up in the garden and hiding in it for hours on end reading, or just making a den in my room, whatever. And I think my love of reading, and in particular as a young adult, I started and cut my teeth on fantasy and science fiction more than I did horror. That love of reading sort of very quickly transformed into a desire to write. So I started writing my own stories. And when I was a precocious 13, 14-year-old, I finished my first ever kind of fantasy novel, I suppose you could call it. It was handwritten into a school exercise book that I hand illustrated the cover for, with a brightly coloured dragon on the front, because it was a flagrant Tolkien ripoff of some sort of quest novel.
Everything that's fantasy is a flagrant Tolkien ripoff, if you really want to think about it. Yeah. So,
right. Yeah. And I made the cover and myself and covered it in sticky back plastic and gave it to my English teacher, who was a lovely man called Mr. Hayward, fully expecting him to sort of, I don't know, sneer at it a little bit. And actually, although it was probably the most derivative 13-year-old twaddle, he was incredibly supportive and very enthusiastic, and gave me lots of great feedback on, how well I'd sort of done this, that, and the other. And I think that fire, once lit, was very hard to extinguish for me. So throughout the next couple of decades, I was just always writing in my spare time if I could, but jobs got in the way, energy, time, and I was never really able to finish anything. I'd start all
Right.
these novels, and I always wanted to write a novel. I was never really able to finish anything until sort of much, much later on in life, in my 30s, when I fell back in love with short stories and realized that short stories are a really, really good way to not only kind of hone your craft and develop your skills as a writer, but also a fantastic way of finishing something
Right.
because
Yeah. Yeah.
the word count is so forgiving. So
Yes.
yes, I sort
4,000.
of
Yeah. 4,000 words is so much easier to write than
well, you would think. I
70 to
now have the
80. Yeah.
opposite. I have the opposite problem now, and that I find it impossible to write a 4,000 word story because everything wants to be a novel. But in order for
Yeah.
me to get to that point, I sort of had to remember how to write again,
Right.
and I think short form was oddly my lesson to help me learn how to finish writing a novel, which doesn't sound very much like it makes sense, but it does in my head.
Yeah.
So
No, that's that's how it works. You just kind of connect the dots up there. As long as the logic works for you, that's all it needs to be. Yeah.
there is no logic in my life. My brain is a hot, chaotic mess, unfortunately.
Yes, that is, I think that is a writer's brain. But I mean, I will say, like, I was looking at your website, which on your website, you are Gemma Amor, author,
Mhm.
illustrator, podcaster. So you are
Mm, sure.
you're very busy. So you do a lot of things. You've got your and also on there, you don't have it listed on there, but you've also been an editor on some anthologies, correct?
So I was a co-editor alongside Cynthia Paleo and Laurel Hightower for an anthology a couple of years back, which was for charity, and it was to help raise money for the victims of and survivors of abuse. And it was called We Are Wolves, and that was a very kind of feminist, I guess, anti-abuse project, which I really enjoyed working on. It was quite grueling. And I am currently contracted with Titan Books, who are quite a well-known genre publisher in the UK and sort of, well, everywhere really, to edit an anthology of ancestral horror stories for them, coming out 2025, and the anthology is called Roots of My Fears. And so far we've got a lovely lineup of quite talented authors like Gabino Iglesias, Primi Mohammed, V Castro. We've just got we've got Ramsey Campbell, Adam Neville, just a lovely array of talent. Nutso Ono, Ai Jiang. So I'm really happy. I'm really excited to be working on that project too.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, I'm a fan of Gabino as well. I read his book Devil Takes You Home
Yeah.
recently. I enjoy following him on social media. He's very active.
Yes.
You are also pretty active on your social media, which I think is very, very fun as well, because I know you're very engaging with your audience, and I think that, it's something as, as I look at it, I was like, oh, that's a good skill to have. Does that come from, like, I see you have a marketing background. Does that tie into that a bit, or?
I mean, partly, yeah. I worked in business marketing for about 10
Ah,
years,
gotcha.
but it was extremely dry and extremely boring. And I mean, I spent years writing website copy for websites advertising eye wash stations and stainless steel
Oh,
urinals. So it didn't really float my boat creatively. But that being said, I have some basic knowledge of like the tenets of marketing. But essentially, my social media presence is the main reason I am able to do what I do for a living. And so the reason I am extremely active on there is kind of because I have to be.
right, yeah.
I would love to get to the I'd love to get to the point that Stephen King's at, where he can just laconically tweet a single sentence, "Hey, I have a new book out today," and that's all he
Yes.
has to do, and he sells millions of copies. I'm not really there.
No.
I've got a
I don't
long
think
way to
anybody
go.
is though, except for Stephen King. Yeah.
You have to be extremely active on all platforms, really, as a writer, until you get to those upper echelons of publishing. And even still, then publishers want you to be active on social because that's how you reach your readers.
Right.
You don't really get much of a choice. So my interactions with people are driven very much by necessity. But I do try and have as much fun as possible as well, because it can be very exhausting. Social media is an extremely draining pastime.
Very
Yeah,
much
it can
so.
be
I agree.
tiring. So
Yeah.
try to just do it in a way which doesn't cross it. You have to have a balance of, I'm proud of my work and I'm selling my work, but I don't want to come across as too arrogant.
Yeah.
But I also don't want to talk myself down and be too self-effacing or too British, because then nobody will really want to read my stuff. So it's a very fine juggling act, and I haven't quite got the hang of it just yet. But
Uh,
I'm,
I would
I'll
say
keep
you
going.
do. I think you do. I think you do a pretty good job of it. But I agree, as a writer, it is important that because in this industry there is so much rejection that happens of,
Hmm.
submitting to literary journals, submitting to anthologies, submitting to publishers, and then, there's just
Yeah.
so many no's that we have to be our own cheerleaders a lot of the times, because that's how we get through those moments, I guess. But
Yeah,
yeah,
it is. And you have to you have to, like you said, you don't always just have to be your own cheerleader, but you have to be your own sorry. You have
you're
to be
fine.
your own motivator and PR person and marketing person and all of the things. Basically, it's being a full-time creative is it's a very broad job description.
Right, right. Yeah, it is a hustle and how long have you been writing full time now?
So since 2018,
Oh,
um,
nice.
it wasn't really something I didn't wake up one day and go, "Hey, I'm going to be a full-time writer today." It was
Right.
mainly because I got fired from 2 jobs in a row because I was having a huge mental breakdown and wasn't really fit to do the job anymore. Um, this coincided with my son starting school when he reached the age, the right age, and I suddenly
Hmm.
found myself with an awful lot of time on my hands. So I thought, well, why not? And I also had a lot of things to work through, a lot of mental health things to work through, and some trauma. And there's no better way of kind of self-therapizing than to write it all
Yeah.
down. So I developed quite a nice routine of dropping my son off at school and heading down to the local cafe and writing every single day and habitualizing myself into sort of being a writer,
Right.
and kind of training my brain to think of myself in that way, and largely because of no sleep, um, which I discovered at the same time. Everything just seemed to sort of slot into place. Really, all the elements seemed to sort of fit together all at the same time. I had spare time. I had a story accepted by no sleep. I was able to develop a social media presence because of that. All sorts of things just all fitted together quite fortuitously at the time. And yeah, and it's been a real ride since then. It's been very busy, lots of ups, lots of downs. It's not an easy gig, but I am very sort of proud of how far I've come, and
Yeah.
in a relatively short space of time. But there's always further to go. There's always.
Yeah, it's
always
always, I would say, yeah, definitely. You've definitely come a long way, and, definitely have a reason to be proud of, what you've accomplished. I see you had a sorry, stripped over that Bram Stoker Award nomination for your first novel. Was that in 2019, somewhere around in there?
Yes, yeah, that
Yeah.
was for achievement in a first novel, and that was for Dear Laura, which was the first kind of long piece of fiction that I published after my short story collection.
Nice.
And last year was nominated for a British Fantasy Award as well for Full Immersion, which came out in 2020, I think,
Nice.
or 2021. Yeah, 2021.
The COVID
And
years all run together.
yeah, it's
It
all
was
it's all a bit of a
2019 and then it
blur.
was 2023. Like,
Right, yeah.
at
Well,
some
it's
point
it's
we
so
took masks off. Yeah.
it's so interesting because at the beginning of 2020, I was actually on tour with the No Sleep podcast. They did their
Oh,
big,
really?
yeah, they did a huge European tour. They toured the UK, and then they went over to Germany and France, I think, was on there, and Sweden. And I finished. I didn't go on the entire tour with them, but I was there for a lot of the English leg, and then I met them out in Stockholm for their like final night of the tour. And it was the show was in the theatre at the Hotel Rival, which is this beautiful kind of like Art Deco style theatre, and it was like sold out, 700 seats. I think it was bonkers night, and they were performing a couple of scripts of mine live on stage, and other writers as well. And the kind of applause, the atmosphere, that it was just absolutely incredible experience. It was a career highlight and still is. And then about 2 or 3 weeks later, I think we went into lockdown. So it
Yeah.
was, it was, yeah. The COVID years were a big blur to me. Everything after
Yes.
Stockholm, I've sort of forgotten what came in what order.
Yeah, it all just kind of we just went into a montage for a number of years and then just sort
Yeah,
of came out of it. But no, that's awesome. I didn't know you were that you got to participate in the tour with him. That's really cool. I they came to my town and I tried to get tickets and somehow I didn't manage to get it, so I'll have to keep an eye
it's
out for
worth
it
a
if they
shot.
come back. Yeah.
If they do live show again, and I don't know
Yeah.
whether that they've got any plans or not, but the live shows are fantastic, and the scripts tend to be a lot more geared towards a live audience, so they tend to be a lot more kind of comedic and
Right.
lively, and but they're always an incredible atmosphere and it's such a good time. Yeah, the live shows are fantastic. If they do tour again, I highly recommend going along.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out. I know Dave, just offhand, I recognize that he's involved in some television projects now. I think he has a TV series that he's working on, like Tales from the Void or
Yeah,
something like that. So
well, yeah, so Tales from the Void is kind of the television version of No Sleep.
no
So
sleep. Yeah.
it pulls a lot of stories. I think season one pulls stories directly from the subreddit, quite famous
Hmm.
stories like Man in Lyset's baby monitor story.
Hmm.
I think the Black Square is probably on the ticket as well, which is a fantastic story by Matt Demirsky, I believe.
Okay.
And yeah, other kind of no sleep classics, and he is yeah, very heavily involved in that, as are other cast members, I believe. People like Brandon Boone, who's scoring the soundtrack, or perhaps the
Yeah.
credit music. I don't know what exactly, but yeah. So that's going to be exciting.
Yeah, that's really cool. I'm glad to see that he's able to make that happen because I know there was a what was the show before? It was Channel Zero. I think that was a Nick Antosca show, which also kind of pulled some stories from the No Sleep
Mm,
archive. And so yeah, it's good to
sure.
see that kind of come back. So yeah.
Yeah, the podcast to TV journey is slightly tumultuous, I believe, and with streaming, who knows whether series are going to perform well or get commissioned, or it's such an unknown world out there at the moment in terms of
Right.
television. But I'm hopeful that it's a success, and yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think if anything has the past few years has proven as the entertainment industry has kind of tried to recover from COVID and then, last year with the actor strike and the writer strike, trying to bounce back and then realizing, hey, we got too many streaming services and there's kind of a
Mm,
pulling back of that. Even in spite of all those things, horror has been a moneymaker. Like it seems like every year there's a surprising horror movie that comes out that like just you know outperforms
mm,
everything. So it's a very it's I don't know, it's still an exciting time for to be involved in horror, but yeah, again with the industry as it is, it's a little scary, kind of the wait and see to see what's going to happen with the way things shake out. But yeah, we shall
sure.
see. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, one other accomplishment that I didn't mention that we were going to talk about is you have a story in the best horror of the year, edited by the great Ellen Datlow. So,
Mm.
how amazing was that to get that to be selected for that?
Yeah, I was really chuffed when I got the email. It was featured in last year's volume 15,
Right.
and it was a very exciting lineup of kind of horror stalwarts, people like Tanana Reeve Dew and Gemma Files, and I always get confused with Gemma Files, so it was quite nice to have my own story in there. Gemma's the name Gemma isn't very prolific outside of the UK.
Yeah.
Um, John Langan, who I'm a big fan of, and who's an extremely nice human being, and it was just, yeah, it was a big privilege. Any recognition, I guess, from my peers, and any industry recognition like that is, you don't need it in order to function, but it's always nice to have it. It's always a nice, I guess, ego boost, but also just it was nice to be recognized and included.
Right.
So yeah, I was
No.
excited.
Yeah, it's always, yeah, like I said, even though we are, driven by the stories that we have to get out, having the external validation that comes on occasions like that, definitely have to celebrate those,
Yeah.
and enjoy them when they happen.
Well,
So
like you
definitely.
said, this creative game that we play, I won't call it a gig. I don't like that expression. And it isn't really a game, it's a job. These
Yeah,
creative careers that we have are,
right,
70 to 80 to 90% of what you do is moored in rejection.
right,
And whether you're querying an agent or whether you've got a book out on submission, which I currently do at the moment, or whether you're sending a short story off to an open submission call or whatever it is, um, there's so much rejection in this industry, and it's just part and parcel of the career. And you have to be incredibly resilient in order to push through rejection after rejection after rejection. But any small win like this that you can get, I think, helps your confidence and just helps to drive you on a little bit when you feel like, what's the point, which you do frequently. I don't write for accolades, I don't write for any other reason than I feel like I have stories to tell. But that being
right,
said, there are certain markers of success that make it more easier for me to get into a creative flow when I'm not worried about paying the bills or worrying about whether my stuff is any good. Do you know what I mean? It's a delicate balance, like I said before, with all the other things that you have to hit, of making sure you create for the right reasons, but also having enough motivation to carry on
right.
in quite a tough industry.
Yeah, I agree. It's there's never, unless again, unless you reach that Stephen King level of being basically your own genre, there's
Mm,
never really a moment where you feel like, all right, I've made it, I can relax, because it always
right.
there's always that, last year's ceiling is this year's floor. You're like, all right, what can I do this year that's,
Oh yeah,
that's
yeah.
improved on that? And it's always just kind of an upward spiral of trying to, you know,
Sure.
work out, and things like that. So yeah,
But I'm
it's a
sure that
challenge.
Stephen King probably has goals that he hasn't met
Oh yeah,
himself. We're a constantly evolving machine when it comes to
right,
raising the bar and raising the ceiling, and enough is never enough. I think once you've hit one milestone and tasted one portion of success, then the next natural human response is, "What's next? What can I do better?" Which is
right,
certainly
yeah.
my problem.
Yeah,
So
yeah, and I think one of the things, especially being able to celebrate those milestones along the way, it does really, like you said, it really helps with the rejections that come. So like,
sure.
when you hit that slump, when it happens, and nothing seems to be, landing the way you want it to, and you start doubting yourself, you have that, like, if I, a year ago, if you'd have told me I would have, done this, I would
Mm,
have been happy to hear that. But then now here you are past that point. You're like, all right, let's
yeah,
keep moving. So yeah, so
yeah.
it's a fun time. Yeah, definitely. All right. So the zoo, what was the inspiration for that story?
Well, I mean, partly driven by, so the zoo was originally included in an anthology edited by Alan Baxter, who's a fantastic Brit-Australian horror author who's been around for
Australia.
some time, and he was editing this anthology. The title escapes me, but I'll come back to it, and you can link to it in the notes or whatever. It
Yeah.
it was, oh, Damnation Games. There we go.
Nice.
And it was, the brief was kind of supernatural crime, essentially.
Right.
So I very much wanted some sort of moody noir kind of setup, but with a very strong supernatural bent.
Right.
So I had in mind an idea for a character who wasn't police but worked with police, so had a little bit of agency outside of kind of traditional police structures, um, and who had, was employed on a consultation basis, and who was essentially psychic. But the only way in which he could learn more about a particular crime and about the perpetrator of a particular crime was he had to get really close to the murder victims and the bodies and the remains and so on and so forth, and sort of, I guess, essentially immerse himself in the on scene crime
Right.
evidence or whatever was left in order to determine the motivations behind the perpetrator. So I had that in my mind because I liked that idea a lot. I had a very sort of Sin City vibe in back of my head, but sort of set in the UK.
Right.
And so I kind of came up with this protagonist called Alistair, who is a psychic who is very driven by his childhood where he was poor and now kind of doesn't really. It's like that classic line that the Joker says, "If you're good at something, never do it for free." In
Right.
I think it's Batman Returns, and he doesn't do what he does for free because because it's you'd be an idiot not to, and when you've got so much power, and B because it's actually extremely taxing and painful for him to do what he does, so he may as
Right.
well charge good money for it. So he's quite sort of financially driven, but also has his own baggage from his childhood that he carries around. And
Yeah.
the idea for the crime that follows, which is a kind of a zoo that has a series of bizarre and horrible um, exhibitions, shall we say, which are members of the public who have been murdered and posed to look like zoo animals.
Yes, it was quite the bloody
Um,
menagerie reading that. Yeah.
yeah, I actually had. I'm not entirely sure where that idea came from, but I've had that sort of bouncing around in my head for a while. And
Hmm.
for anyone that hasn't read it, I'm sorry there are spoilers in this
Yeah. We'll
interview,
link.
but
Yeah. Yeah.
I wanted very much for the perpetrator of the crime to be a child because I don't know whether you've got kids or not, but I've got a kid and I've grown up. I've watched him grow up, and when children are very small, the way they play with their toys and the way they make art and create things is quite deranged in
Right.
quite
Right.
a lot
Right.
of ways. I wrote another short story a while ago for the No Sleep podcast that went into my short story collection, Cruel Works of Nature. And that was about a little boy who had a sketchbook and he drew things in the sketchbook that came to life. But if you've ever seen a kid's drawing,
Right.
kids draw quite terrifying things because they haven't got a handle on proportion or perspective or anything yet. So the things literally came to life verbatim off the page and were terrifying as a result. And I wanted to explore that theme a little bit more. And I came up with this idea of a kid who was kind of similarly traumatized to the main protagonist, and she was working through her trauma from abandonment by kind of making these models. But
Hmm.
what she didn't fully appreciate was that those models had a real life counterpart.
Right.
So yeah, I'm not entirely sure where exactly that came from, but it was a series of themes and things I wanted to explore that all just sort of came together very well.
Yeah, no, I agree. It did come together very well. I really love the protagonist in it. Like you said, like he came from a poor background, and there's a lot of projection early on of him being concerned about his looking like he has money because he wants people to know there's a little
Sure.
insecurity like playing with him there. And I thought that was really a really
Yeah.
fun way to introduce the character. And like I said, really, really interesting story. Very like I said, the details of the graphic posing of the people in the zoo was very creepy to read as well. So yeah, very well done, and
Thank
it
you.
definitely belonged in the best horror of the year anthology. So
Thank
definitely.
you. And if anybody wants to listen to the audio version of it, No Sleep did adapt it um,
Oh,
into I think like an hour long special, and the sound effects for it are are
oh, oh,
utterly fantastic, and the music as well is really really good for that one. I think it's
yeah.
narrated by David Alt, who
Oh,
does a
okay.
wonderful wonderful job.
No, I'll have to
Yeah,
check that out.
yeah,
I will link to that as well when I find it. So that sounds really cool. Yeah. So yeah, so bonus, I also wanted to talk about another story of yours because like I said, I had yeah, kind of been familiar with your work, but I had bought the anthology Human Monsters by I think it was Dark Matters put out, and
yeah, yeah,
you have like this story, like I don't know, it just had a profound effect on me because I was reading it, and in the story where like most of the stories in the Human Monsters were really focused on people who were performed monstrous acts, but your story kind of twisted, and all the focus is on giving a face, literally giving a face to a victim, which I thought was
yeah.
yeah, I thought that was just, it's such a great twist and just a great way of like kind of flipping horror on its head because a lot of times you know, a lot of times when I'm writing stories and going over stories with my manager, he's like, "All right, we got to have some cool kills in this," and it's all about just kill, slaughter, maim, and then
Mm,
it's like, oh, we got to think about this. Your story, like I said, it focused more on the victim and giving them a voice, giving them a face, and the
sure.
the 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 main character's connection to that as well as a anthologist. So yeah, very very brilliant story. And on that, the detail of the reconstruction. How did you do a lot of research on that? A lot of googling, or
I did. I did. So there's a couple of things about that story. I think that picking up on the theme of giving the victim a face and a voice that's a very recurring theme for me because I think I see a lot of true crime documentaries, podcasts, whatever, where we do focus on the perpetrator a great deal,
right,
to the detriment of the victims who were actually harmed, and we tend to glamorize, celebritize serial killers, and because their acts are so shocking, and we really want to understand the psychology and what motivated them and what they were like and what they ate for breakfast, and essentially turning these quite normal in many cases, except for their proclivities, people into these big legendary characters, and it utterly deletes the victims' voices, faces, whatever memories from kind of public consciousness. So I often think that for me, the horror actually lies in imagining what a person went through who was on the
right.
receiving end of violence. That to me feels more horrific than trying to get inside the head of somebody that could do something like that. And that's just a personal thing for me. So it's a recurring theme. And I did that very much with Dear Laura. That was why I wrote Dear Laura. That was kind of my response to stories like, films about Ted Bundy and so on,
Mhm.
of which there are too many, I think. But
Agreed.
um, with Eggshell, I had been working on this idea for a while as a direct tribute to a fantastic lady who's written a couple of books and who's had an incredible career as a forensic anthropologist and professor of anatomy. And she's called Dr. Sue Black. And she is a Scottish lady. And I believe she's very good friends with author Val McDermott. And she kind of advises her on various different crime scene details and anatomical references and things. But her whole career outside of being an incredible anatomist and professor of anatomy has been as a forensic anthropologist being sent off to remote corners of the world in the wake of either natural disasters or conflict zones or human atrocities, and
Mhm.
helping to um, reunite human remains with family members so that they can be identified, and then those family members can have some closure and some sort of
Right.
funereal arrangement. And so she's written a book about her experiences. She's written two actually, but the first one was a book that kind of profoundly changed me, and it was called what was it called? I've got it somewhere. It's downstairs. All that remains, I believe it's called, and it's just talking about everything from the way the body's put together, to her thoughts on death, to her experiences in active war zones and after things like the Boxing Day tsunami, um, to her own opinions about what should happen at the end of your life. And there's a couple of fascinating chapters in there. She's often called in to help identify remains that have been found when the the main driver has been to conceal the identity of the victim. So
Right.
dismemberment, defacing, removing teeth, fingernails, fingerprints, limbs. And so there's a couple of fascinating chapters in that book about how people tend to go about doing that. And there tend to be kind of trends and habits that murderers trying to conceal their tracks often do. And
Mhm.
she talks in great detail about identifying marks and how you can tell if somebody's male or female and all sorts of things. It's fascinating, and I think she's an incredible woman. So I knew I wanted to write a story with a character very heavily based on her as a big
Right.
tribute, because I find just the work that she's done utterly inspiring. If you think about how many families have just at least gotten some measure of closure because of
Right.
the positions and the work that she's done. And yeah, so and it just became a natural progression for me to I wanted with the human monsters thing, it was a perfect fit for a story
Right. It
about somebody
was.
trying to give a victim back her face. And I had this idea for a murderer who went out of his way to destroy human remains to the point where they could never be identified, so it could never be traced back to him. But not counting for the kind of forensic skills of this, again, another police consultant who worked with the local university to piece back together fragments of a skull. And I did lots of research, and I did find some other wonderful experts who did some fantastic YouTube tutorials about their own reconstructive processes, and whether they're archaeologists or working on more modern cases. And I sort of, that combined with Sue Black's materials, I sort of sandwiched all of this research together to come up with this story. And it was very research heavy, but I really enjoyed going down that rabbit hole. Yeah, I took a few creative licenses with a couple of the bits, but yeah.
Yeah, you have to, but it's understood. But yeah, I mean, definitely at reading it though, like I could not tell where those were. So then masterfully done. I'm sure if Dr. Sue Black were to read it, she could probably, line out the things. That's not how we do that. That's not how we do that. It's
Yeah,
like, gotta
probably.
have
I've
a little,
probably
yeah,
got all the anatomy wrong as well, so she'd probably roll her eyes, but it is
yeah,
meant as a kind of tribute to her
right,
her
yeah,
knowledge and her expertise and, yeah,
yeah.
the work that she
No,
does.
no, I agree. Like I said, when I read that story, like set in that book particularly, it was just a like one of those where I actually kind of had to set it down. I was like, wow, like all this time I've been, reading these stories more focused on the killer. And then, like you said, there's, it's kind of
Mm.
a joke. Like people say, oh, I'm gonna put on a murder show and fall asleep, which is like, okay, that's again, it does kind of glorify, celebritize, and, almost put these
Yeah,
monsters as superheroes, and we lose the victims when it's really horrific that
right.
that does happen. So like I said, brilliant story, beautiful story.
Thank
Had an
you.
effect on me. I was really excited to read it and talk to you about it today. So
Thank
yeah, that
you.
was well done. So
Thank
what
you.
else? What do you have in the pipeline? Is there anything you can share? Anything you got coming up or coming out or?
Gosh, I have so much. I've just had a book just released last week, the
Oh
week
yes,
before,
yeah,
through Cemetery Gates Media. It's another collection of short stories, and it's called All Who Wander Are Lost, which is
right,
a very deliberate play on Tolkien's famous quote, "All who wander are not lost."
right,
Mine is the more depressing take on that. And they're horror stories that are what I kind of affectionately call destination-based horror stories. So they're travel-themed horror,
right.
and they're very much rooted in places and destinations that I've been lucky enough to visit. It was something I started sort of compiling during lockdown when my wanderlust was I was unable to satiate my wanderlust because I was in lockdown. And that's been received really well so far. I've been really enjoying reading the reviews. And the stories go to places like Antarctica and Mongolia and Egypt and France and all over the world, basically Venice. I had a great time putting that one together. So, All Who Wander Are Lost is out in ebook and paperback format at the moment on Amazon, and I'm hoping for an audiobook shortly.
Nice.
Um, yeah, so that's just come out. I did have a novella out in December with an outfit called Polis Books called The Folly, which was a sort of supernatural coastal crime thriller possession horror about an ex-convict who is released from prison, cleared of the murder of his wife after kind of a re-examination of his case, and he moves to the countryside with his grown-up daughter to try and start a new life after his release, and they become caretakers of a tower overlooking the ocean called the Folly. And it's all about sort of family secrets. It's very much a tribute to Daphne du Maurier. That actually was released in December, and then the publisher announced that they were folding about 3 months later. So that was a bit of a shame.
Yeah.
It is still available, but I have a feeling very shortly I shall be able to share some good news about the future of that book. So keep your eye out for that.
Yep. Fingers
It's
crossed.
been a bit of a journey, that one, but this
Yeah.
happens in this. Publishers come and publishers go.
Yeah.
Aside from that, I have a novel out on submission at the moment, which hopefully will find a home. I've also just finished writing a feature-length screenplay adaptation of Dear Laura, which was my Bram Stoker Award-nominated novella.
Nice.
And that's hopefully circulating a couple of desks, which is a very nice thing to be able to say, even if it goes nowhere. But keep your fingers crossed.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
I've got all sorts of fingers in all sorts of pies, but the main thing that I hope to achieve with the rest of the year is, aside from kind of fulfilling book cover design contracts, hopefully launching a new podcast, is to just sit down and finish writing another novel. So that's for my second half of the year, is to finish the next novel. I think that will be book number 12 or 13, something like that.
Oh, wow. Nice. Yeah. Yeah. I didn't even get a chance to ask you about that. I was going to ask you about the illustrating. How did you come into that?
I mean, I've always drawn. I've always loved art. I've always been drawn to art. It was very much a hobby for me. I have a habit of turning my hobbies into my job, which means I need to find a new hobby. It was just a natural progression for me. I started off doing book-related things by providing a series of interior illustrations for Cruel Works of Nature, which was my first ever published book, which was a collection of short stories. And I loved doing the interior illustrations for that. And then I did the cover art for Dear Laura, which people seem to really like. And then after that, I just thought, well, I may as well just open up for commissions. And I've been lucky enough to work with a number of indie authors now who seem to like my style. I work in quite a pulpy, colourful. I think horror should be colourful. So lots of kind of bright, hand-painted imagery, which people seem to really respond to and like, which is awesome. So yeah, lots of happy indie author clients, which I've loved working with. I get to paint a Sasquatch next week, which is something I've always wanted to do. Yeah, so that's I'm enjoying those.
Yeah, so checking off another goal from the list there, painting a Sasquatch. There you go.
Yeah.
Well, Gemma, it has been a pleasure talking to you today. And again, very glad to have you. And like I said, I will put a link in the show notes to pretty much everything that I can, because you've got a lot going on out there. Definitely a link to your website. And like I said, if I can find that No Sleep retelling of the zoo, I will definitely put that in there as well. But again, thank you so much. Like I said, and again, thanks.
No worries. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
You can find more information about Gemma's work and latest releases by visiting her website, gemmaamorauthor.com, or by following her on Instagram and the website formerly known as Twitter @ManyLittleWords. Links are in the show notes. If there's an author you'd like to hear from, or if you're an author who would like to chat about your work, email at storyclubpod@gmail.com. Thanks for hanging out with us today at the Storytellers Club. I have been your host, Chris Hicks. Until next time, thanks for listening.